Hi, I'm Anthony King. I am here for our session on smoke, speaking with winemakers from around the world. Um, we are going to be talking for the next hour about our experiences with smoke in various regions, mitigation techniques during harvest, mitigation post harvest, which would be helpful right now. And then also, if we get to it, some discussion about sales and how other regions have fared with selling wine that had some smoke impact. Today we have three winemakers on with me. Marla Carroll from Antica and Napa Valley, Ann Siri from Highland Estates and Northwest Wine Company, and Peter Lesky from Reveneer and La Linea in Australia. Um, and I want to start with setting some context to the conversation. If you can each go over uh, kind of what you've seen in smoke. I know that Marla, for instance, and Peter, you've dealt with smoke in a couple different years. And Marla, actually, Anne, I'm going to start with you and tell me about what you saw in this last year in 2020 and where you were getting your fruit.
Yes, so 2020 was my first experience with smoke. Um, it was unfortunate that just right after Labor Day, we got smoke all over the valley. We get fruit from as north as West Lynn and as south as the Red Hills of Douglas County, which is just a few hundred miles right there, and every single vineyard that we received fruit from was impacted. We received fruit from about 52 vineyards all over all AVAs of the Willamette Valley, all seven AVAs. And yes, we did notice just really early that we would just have to deal with a smoke issue as soon as we just started collecting samples.
You were very helpful to the industry. You had one of your clients from California who ended up being a great help and hosted sessions, also was on some of the Oregon Wine Board calls as well. And we really appreciate you bringing her to the industry. Marla, can you tell us about your experience?
So this year we had two different fires. We had the LNU lightning complex fire, which was at the end of August, which was before we had picked any fruit. And that fire was adjacent to our property. It burned right up to the border of our vineyard. And then there was a second fire towards the end of September, which was the glass fire, which was further up valley, but the smoke was actually more severe from that fire than from the first fire. So by that time we had most of our whites in, but most of our Cabernet was still in the vineyard. So that was what we dealt with this year. In 2017, we dealt with fires as well. We had pretty much fires on all sides. But at this property, there was the heaviest impact from the Atlas fire because we're on Atlas Peak, which is where the Atlas fire started. But there was also the Tubbs fire, the Partrick fire, and the Nuns fire. So we were pretty much surrounded by fires in 2017. So.
And you were at Franciscan in 2017?
Yeah, so I was with Constellation, working on both Franciscan and Mount Veeder brands. And the fires in 2017 burned on Mount Veeder directly through vineyards that we were getting fruit from. So.
Did you work during the fires?
Yeah, we worked throughout the whole thing. So turned out that with the Mount Veeder fruit, we were not able to salvage the fruit. The fires went right through the vineyard, so the damage was just too severe. For the Franciscan fruit, it was smoke impact, but it wasn't direct fire impact. So we did see some smoke taint, but to varying degrees depending on where the vineyards were that we were sourcing fruit from. So we were able to salvage, fruit and have wine to work with in 2017.
Most of us were surrounded sort of by fires, but the fires were much further away. Down in the south, they were much closer, but what you guys are dealing with is super scary.
Yeah, very.
Peter, I wanted to ask you about your experiences not only with the vineyard, but then if you can just take us from what you've seen. I think your story plays out pretty nicely in terms of talking about what you saw in earlier vintages. And if you can take us from those experiences all the way through to sort of how you've developed systems by which you kind of look at these years and assess fruit in the vineyard. Do you mind doing that for us?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough that our properties were not directly affected. Our first experience was back in January 2015, so 60 days before you'd normally pick fruit in the Adelaide Hills. That was a relatively localised fire. It was quite large, but the smoke impacts, just because of where it was in relation to the vineyards, were relatively minor. But we certainly saw smoke taint in red fruit that year. The big one for us was a fire that started on the 20th of December, so just before Christmas 2019. So having an impact on the 2020 vintage. That was it was half as big again. It was officially about 63,000 acres, if that puts it into context for you. But it burnt up to, into, and around probably about a third of the vineyard area in the whole of the Adelaide Hills. Some vineyards had smoke drifting across them. Some had fire actually up and down the rows. The vineyard management here is generally to keep grass under the rows, because a lot of vineyards are on slopes, and to control erosion, we keep permanent sward. And that was actually part of the issue, because the grass caught fire and it ran up the rows. Then drip lines caught fire, then posts and lines. And the third event was actually 48 hours ago. You don't know about this yet, but we had a fire that started on Monday afternoon. It was a 42-degree day, which is about 110 in your language, with strong winds. Burnt for about 48 hours before quite heavy rain controlled it, exactly 36 hours ago. But at that point, we had ashy rain falling on our vineyard here. So I don't quite know yet what that means. We're just sort of about to go under Verizon.
But right now you're not sitting in smoke. You've got smoke high in the.
No, I'm looking out at a beautiful blue sky. It's about, it was only about 13 degrees C, whatever that is in your language here this morning. It's fresh, crisp morning after some rain 24 hours ago, 36 hours ago. So yeah, the crisis is over, but the impact may yet still be felt. Certainly some vineyards to the south of us here, where the fire was, will have had some smoke exposure, which just goes with our topography and our vegetation. So Anthony, you'd like me to talk a bit about the sort of sensory work that we did back this time last year, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. For us, we were spending a lot of time talking to people from California, but then also calling winemakers and others with experience in Australia, and of course, all reading IWRI, where you worked for 5 years or so. Is that right?
Yeah, I was at the Institute 5 years, 4 or 5 years, or 15, 20 years ago. I was very, very, very young. But I was still in close contact with those guys, and I guess because of that time, have a predisposed to take a community view to these sorts of things. And because of the timing of that fire, the advice from the Institute was that people should wait until Verizon before doing any sampling. So the first issue was that people were very frustrated and angry about that, because they were potentially going to be still spending money managing vineyards from which the fruit was ruined. But it was unusual to have such an intense, short event so early in the season. Traditionally, Australian fire and smoke exposure has been later in the season when the fruit's riper. So we now know, without any shadow of a doubt in my mind, that fruit, while green and pea-sized, can still be smoke affected. That was a new certainty that arose from last year. When the fruit did ripen, one of the issues, of course, is that anybody assessing their own microferment is far from objective, and you need more than one person's opinion. So we organised to help make microferments for people, just as a community service, if you like, because if you're a grape grower and you don't have a lab, you don't have the pipettes and the measuring cylinders and the balances and things. So we made lots of samples for people, as did the University of Adelaide campus just down the road, and a couple of other wineries as well. Arguably more important was, I guess, to mobilise a whole lot of regional tasters, and this was with the help of the IWRI. So their principal role was to provide a session, very brief session, it doesn't take long, where the potential pool of tasters were challenged with known solutions of smoke taint compounds. We recorded those results, and from that actually rejected 3 out of, I think, 15 people who were available to be in the pool. So from that, we had a dozen people who we knew were not anosmic to smoke taint compounds. And we got into a system of every Wednesday morning at, I think it was 9 a.m., which gave us a bit of time to set up from 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning. The panelists gathered. We had assistance from the local Adelaide Hills wine region. One of the staff members was there to help code samples. There's a lot of manual work that needs to be done. Samples need to be collected, collated, put into a spreadsheet after you've organised random numbers for them. So there's just hack work to be done. So we had the anosmic tasters were kind enough to put their hands up to be stewards. The rest of us were tasters. And the Institute is actually still working on a document which will summarise how to do this in practice, and I'm sort of peripherally involved in that. But my role, I guess, was to organise the thing, collate the samples, organise random numbers, put them into a spreadsheet, organise a pouring order. I went out to one of the vineyards that we knew was smoke unaffected and picked about 50 kilos of fruit and made that into a small lot wine that we had control, unaffected wine, which was an important part of the process. I organised to put repeats in, so when we had samples submitted from all and sundry and we had enough wine, I would just grab that wine and randomly put that in as a repeat. So this was applying some sort of scientific rigour to the whole process. Not enough to satisfy entirely the guys at the Institute, who are used to working in far more, I guess, scientifically robust circumstances than we are. But I hosed down some of their concerns. I guess put my own whatsits on the line a couple of times and made decisions about what we could and couldn't do and what was realistic and what was an acceptable compromise and what wasn't. And the good news was when they then tested our panel in May at the end of vintage, we all had a bit more time, they gave our panel some samples that they had put through their more scientific panel. And I wasn't surprised, but I was pleased to find that our results coincided very closely with theirs. So it was all spreadsheet driven. I became a dab hand at Excel. The problematic part was finding time to look at the results because we used the 0 to 9 scale that the Institute proposes. That was done on paper. Then we had to, somebody called out the results, entered into a spreadsheet, sort the spreadsheet, chuck it out into an email, send people emails. So there is quite a lot of work to be done, but it works. It can be done.
But what I respect about it is it's a rigorous process by which then there's a feedback system, and then also you're generating huge amounts of data that's supported, and that something that we weren't spiking samples, which you talked about in terms of sort of testing or training and looking for people who can't see these compounds. And then the thing that we had trouble with, as Anne said, we had such widespread smoke. We didn't really have we only had a few wines that were picked before the smoke to compare to. And you find yourself wondering, is this how this always tastes right now? Especially when it's just that little bit of bitterness on the back end of the palate. And so that seems like a very helpful thing to have.
Yeah. Interestingly, we tended to work with palate rather than nose impression, although there were some wines which were just so smoky it was pretty clear. If you're an Australian wine show judge, you all know the acronym DNPIM, do not put in mouth. And there were a few DNPIM wines. There was a bit of confusion in the tasters, and there still is, about exactly how to go about this. The Institute's instructions were somewhat ambiguous. What we did generally, although we discovered after the event some people were doing something slightly different, was we would taste the wine and then hold the wine, but then spit, expectorate, but then hold what remnant you had in your mouth for that 2-minute period before making a final decision. Then rinse with water, then do the next sample. That's all about the enzyme action in your palate, showing smoke taint over a period of time in your mouth, and the retronasal effect when you breathe out gently. So it's a bit of an acquired skill. I would not suggest that people make a quick decision based on 30 seconds in the mouth, then rinse with water and then wait. I think the Institute needs to clarify exactly how they want people to go about it, and maybe other people, other experiences. but we found that holding in the mouth for that period of time, that little bit of remnant after it's back was quite important. We didn't differentiate between nose and palate. We just gave one score for the wine based on the impression on nose and palate. Score
If you were to be training someone, if you could just train us on what you're looking for, if you're not looking for sort of a smoke compound, especially when it's on right at threshold, what are you looking for on the palate as you're waiting over that 2-minute period?
Personally, I'm looking for some smoky aroma and flavour. One of the difficulties I think with looking for residual bitterness, for example, is that these are all skin contact wines, which is because they're all coming out of microferments. And it is very important for people to understand that the microferment technique is not commercial winemaking. It bears no resemblance to commercial winemaking. The fruit's much greener, the skin contact applies, and the wines are unclarified. And they're horrendously acidic quite often. We had wines which were probably 8 or 9% alcohol with 14 or 15 grams per liter of acid. This is a form of torture, really. I referred to it as what's the term when you're scared of spiders? There's a psychological term. It'll come to me.
Like arachnophobia.
No. It's the remedial technique, aversion therapy. Okay, it's a spider. It's a spider. I get that. I know it's a spider. I still hate it. So we were looking for aroma and a little bit of flavour. Because the wines were so acidic and they'd had skin contact, bitterness and mouthfeel is a difficult concept because these are not wines as we normally know them. So that residual ashy, arguably earthy ashtray smokiness is an aroma and flavour and a retronasal thing that you can detect. That was principally how I...
Yeah. I think what I'll do is, while your internet is recorrecting, I want to switch over to Marla and just ask how that differed from the process that you have in place, given that it's your second year, and what you saw around your estate.
I think our process was much less scientific, unfortunately. And what we did is, after the first fire, we were pretty alarmed, so we collected samples from different blocks around our estate, both close to the fire and further away, focusing more on red varietals. We really didn't do any bucket ferments on white varietals. Focusing mostly on Cabernet, a little bit on Cabernet Franc and some Merlot. So we were really focused on sensory, and unfortunately we have a pretty small team, so it was really just me tasting the bucket ferments every single day. And then also, unfortunately, because ETS, which is the lab that we were using, got really overwhelmed with samples, we weren't able to get results really quickly enough in order to make decisions. We were able to get some results from a lab up in Washington through our custom crush winery that we work with. So we were able to have some numbers to kind of give us a gauge, but ultimately, the numbers didn't drive my decisions too much because we are working with estate fruit. So I just feel like we're in a very different situation than a lot of wineries who have contracts and who are purchasing fruit and have to make the tough call of whether or not to bring that fruit in.
Yeah.
We made the decision fairly early on not to file an insurance claim for our fruit, despite the fact that the fire was really close. We felt after the 2017 fires and after the success we had treating the wine and the wine that we put into the bottle, we were really pleased with after all was said and done. So we felt confident enough after our experience with 2017 that with the amount of smoke we had and the impact we were seeing in the bucket ferments, just by the early sensory results and early numbers we were seeing, we felt confident enough picking.
Yep.
We knew pretty early on that we weren't going to be making our top tier reserve style wines, but we did go forward and pick our estate fruit. So it was more, for me, it was more information to have on hand, but I kind of already had a plan in my mind based on my experiences in 2017. Now, of course, if I had been purchasing fruit, I would have had to be a lot more rigorous with it. and
Right.
would have had to use those numbers to make really tough decisions about what fruit to bring in and what not to bring in. But I will say that our custom crush client gets a large amount of fruit from our property. They purchase fruit from us and then we ferment it here. And they brought everything in, based on their experience, knowing what they brought in 2017, knowing the treatments that they used and the success of those treatments, and feeling confident about the wine they put in the bottle. They decided to bring everything in, except for stuff that was really, really close in proximity to the fire. We didn't pick that for us, and they didn't pick that for themselves.
Did you find that a lot of people in Napa not pick based on the smoke? And was it varietal dependent? Was there a lot less picking of Pinot Noir, for instance, down in Carneros?
I think most people pick their Pinot Noir because, that was after the first fire. And I feel like people were thinking, oh, the fire was far enough away. I think a lot of people down in Carneros were actually surprised how much impact there was, because the fire was fairly far, seemed fairly far away, but there was significant impact in Pinot Noir. But most people I know ended up picking. But it was more the Cabernet Sauvignon that people left on the vine, because that was what was impacted from the glass fire, the second fire. And that was further up valley, so closer in proximity to where most of the Cabernet Sauvignon is grown in Napa. And just the smoke was a lot worse than the first fire.
Peter?
The Hunter Valley experience was very different to the Adelaide Hills, where we had fire in and around the hills and up to vineyards. The Hunter fires were at their closest, probably somewhere between 5 and 10 miles from the vineyard area. But they had long-term exposure, and they referred to smoke taint impact as much as 30 miles from the fire source, or the smoke source. So proximity is part of it, but it doesn't have to be close. It's duration of exposure to some extent as well. And there's all sorts of theories about the age of the smoke, of course, as well.
Yeah, and that's what we saw here, which is perfect to go to Anne. And you ended up doing bucket ferments and measurements, but then you ended up bringing in most of the fruit. Is that right?
Yes. So the difference, I guess, with a couple of the other experience for us, it was so close to harvest. We had this fire a couple of days before our first pick. So we ended up just doing bucket fermentation, because that's what one of our clients from California, who has a lot of experience with it, recommended. She sent us the whole protocol, and we did over 50 bucket fermentation. So one for almost each of our vineyards. We didn't do per varietal, but I did a few white buckets just to see how whites would differ from the Pinots. And we tasted them. It was very hard to taste the first 12 days because there was so much smoke that we didn't have a room in a winery that was not smoke impacted. So we thought we could smell it, taste it, but it was just it was in the air. It was so thick we couldn't really just tell apart what was the wine, what was the atmosphere. And then it was so widespread that we decided that we could not just let the fruit hang, and we had to start just picking. So we made the decision that seemed difficult at the time or easy. I'm not sure if it was just what would have been easier. We went in and said we're gonna pick. As soon as the fruit actually reached maturity, we'll pick and we'll deal with it. And the micro ferment ended up just being more of a map for me, just to decide what to prioritize to treat. When fruit would come in, I would know which lot was more impacted and which lot needed just to be treated right away. The amount of people, the amount of product, just to treat everything as they would come in.
Yeah.
So it was just mostly a tool just to help us manage just the fermentation.
So getting into what you did during harvest, can you start with the whites? Because you actually worked with whites that were pretty close to the larger fires.
Yeah.
Very heavily impacted. What were you doing to do as much mitigation work as you could then?
Yeah, so we have a few hundred tons coming from a vineyard that is in Silverton, so it was less than 3 miles away from the edge of the fire. We saw numbers. So we sent a few of our lots for microferment to the labs, and as fruit, we were above 60 ppb of guaiacol, which, if you translate in just finished wine, would just have to be like about 4 times the amount. So huge amount of guaiacol, and we smelled it. The fruit would come in, and just as we were just putting it into the press, we could smell it. So I did what we typically do on our Pinot Gris, just did some flotation. But instead of just the regular bentonite and gelatin mix that I do, I added also a lot of carbon. So 500 ppm of the phenol-free carbon that we've been using. So deodorizing carbon that was supposed to specifically target the phenols, or at least help with it. And then just some casein and some PVPP at 20 grams per hectoliter. So not huge dose, but just a lot more than what we typically would do on our whites. And the goal was just to press, float, and clean the wine as much as possible. So once the wine was racked from flotation, we had almost a 0 NTU. So we had just completely removed every solid from the wine. And at the same time, we were hoping just to have removed as many phenol as possible. And it turns out that down the road, post-fermentation, sending to the lab, we ended up just having that particular wine that was at above 60 ppb of guaiacol ended up just being under 4 post-fermentation of the free guaiacol. So it was still slightly impacted, but to the point that we're able just to blend it away.
That's amazing. And just since other people don't have flotation, I think other people around the valley were struggling with trying to figure out how to get carbon out of their juice. And
that
all sorts of very good protocols around, it turns out. But certainly using cooling and maybe enzymes or gel, all of that fun stuff for one of the ugliest processes I've had to do.
Yes. Yeah, it's a little bit of a mystery still for me just to remove carbon. Everyone that I talk to will just say, it's so easy. Just if you ask the rep, it's so easy. Just put some silica. It will drop. It does not drop.
Right, yeah.
It does not work like that. I was fortunate enough just to have a flotation device, and it worked out.
Yeah. On reds, you experienced, you did some of the techniques that I saw people doing of using carbon on juice after cold soak. You also did some work with using other skins. Can you tell us about what you found, to just quickly go through the things you tried and then what you found to be most effective?
Yes, so we did a lot of just skin contact for 3 days, draining the juice, treating with a mix of carbon, gelatin, bentonite to try to settle the carbon, and then back on its skin for fermentation. That worked for the wine that had just low level of impact. So we would smell it at the beginning, and then just after the treatment, we're just pretty confident the wine was fairly cleaned up. There was still an edge remaining, but it helped quite a bit. On the very impacted lot, what worked the best was direct pressing and fermenting on the skin of a lot that was less impacted. Like I said, we did not have a single lot that was not impacted at all. So we had just to go and choose the one that seemed to be the cleanest. And today, side by side, the same grapes that came into the winery at there were just over 45 ppb of guaiacol as grapes. The finished wine of the one that we floated with carbon but fermented on its own skin ended up just at 50. So it's still just really high. The one that was fermented on another skin is at 8 ppb.
Oh, wow.
So dramatically different.
So by that, you actually mean that you take skins off of something that you just pressed off, and then you drain, and then you put it over the top.
Yeah.
So not
so we
pressing.
didn't press. Yeah, exactly. We just drain and then push. So instead of doing the same ratio of skin to juice, we ended up I had just to half the amount of juice to try to keep some color. Luckily, the 2 lots that we chose to keep that had the clean skin are also lots that have a lot of color. So I didn't have to use any enzyme, anything to overly extract. They were just reached naturally.
Yeah, we got lucky with a lot of good color this year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you end up going, there's a discussion about whether you make be very gentle, cooler fermentations, shorter time on skins versus, which we heard actually when we talked to several people from Australia, and then also some from California as well. But many people seem to be of the idea of make a bigger wine so that maybe when you're treating it, it can handle it. Also, for more of a masking effect. Which way did you end up going?
We went with bigger. We
Okay.
typically go pretty extractive, and I was not particularly confident in just changing our own protocol, not knowing where we were going. I would just rather just stick with what we knew and then just try to remove as much as we could. And at the end, I'm glad we did it this way. We had some grapes that we're selling to a client who ended up rejecting it once the wine was made. And he went the route of just being very gentle, low extraction. And when we received the wine was a lot more impacted than the same wine that we made just from the same grapes. And we went just all out in extraction. That being said, we didn't add enzyme or anything, but just we went high in temperature, in the mid 80s, and then just our normal extraction. I want to say just a
Right.
couple of pump
Yeah, make
overs,
the
punch
best one.
down. Exactly. And I'm not saying it was the best solution for everything, but so far it seems just to be hiding. At least the big tannins are hiding that dryness, that ashiness that we get on the wines that don't have that kind of structure.
Yeah. And Marla, you ended up in 17 doing something different than you did this last year. Is that right? In terms of how you approached philosophically making the wine?
Yeah, in 2017, it was so new to us here in Napa. I think everyone felt probably the way you guys felt this year. And so we decided to go the cooler temperature, get it off skins quickly, try to have a little bit less extraction route. And we pretty quickly realized that we were making weaker wines and that you could still smell the smoke.
Yeah.
And so even in 2017, from the beginning of harvest to the end of harvest, we had kind of switched gears and kind of gone back to our normal protocol, because we didn't want to make weak wines that were smoky. So in this year, I knew going out the gate, we're going to, hit it pretty hard and make, 2020 had really good color potential going into the vintage. And so we felt like there was a lot of potential there to make strong, full-bodied wines. And so,
Yep.
we pulled a decent amount of Saunier. We did pretty hot fermentations. We typically don't leave our wines on skins that long. It was around 14 days, on skins. We're a mountain site, so we have pretty big tannin, so we don't need to stay on skins very long to have good tannin. So,
Yep.
we have pretty high alcohols, and some lots stuck because of the high alcohols, which I was kind of okay with, because I feel like a little bit of residual sugar this year doesn't hurt to sort of mask some of the unpleasant finish that you can get with smoke tainted wines. So I'm pleased with the decision.
The high alcohol was purposeful? Meaning,
Yeah,
were you trying?
Normally we'd sort of go probably a little higher alcohol with our higher end wines and lower alcohol with our sort of Napa Valley or core tier wines, but we kind of went higher alcohol with everything this year. Because I didn't want to overly dilute the wines, knowing that we might have to treat them later and that we might be losing some body and weight later on. So I really wanted a lot of richness and even the sweetness that you get from alcohol to contribute to the wines. So.
And the Saunier is an interesting one in terms of that you've got these compounds in the skin. It feels counterintuitive.
Yeah, and maybe it wasn't the right decision, but I feel like it was for us. Because it is counterintuitive in terms of you're concentrating what's going to be giving you smoke character. But I guess my thought is, all the research has shown that the smoke compounds come out within the first 5 days of fermentation anyway. So if it's going to be there, I would rather build up as much as possible the body of the wine that I have.
Right.
Hope that either I can treat the wine that's left behind, or I can mask it through the complexity and richness of the wine that I have available.
Yep.
That's my decision making. Right or wrong?
Peter, yeah, I like it. I like that answer too. Peter, what do you have to add in terms of harvest mitigation before we move on to what we do at this point in time with wine and barrel?
Our experience here was with white fruit. We took the approach, again, right or wrong, who knows, but based on the observed taint in white fruit, a lot of the red fruit just wasn't picked throughout the hills. I think was quite common. And speaking to friends up in the Hunter Valley, that was a common perspective as well. And we could talk about the decision-making difficulties of whether you're an estate and you've already invested to grow the fruit, or whether you're buying fruit from somebody else and they've spent the money, how much you need the fruit. The risk-return equation is different for everybody, depending on the circumstances. But a lot of people chose not to pick red. Those who did make reds, probably, I think I'm right in saying that most Australians have taken the opposite route to Marla and Anne, and they've gone for shorten the skin contact, reduce temperature, make a lighter wine, with the theory being, of course, to extract less smoke taint compounds. But of course, you've got to weigh up what your market is for what volume of a slightly different style. Let's imagine you make a smoke taint free wine. Is that what your market expects? Is that what your consumers expect, or do you actually have to try and sell it on the bulk market?
Right.
Because in the US has an active bulk market like Australia. So it's a sort of recovery mode you go into. There's a whole lot of different options to take. By far, most people that I've spoken to, their experience has been remediating white wine and not doing it as wine, but doing it as juice. So most Australian experience is in juice treatment. And that's the very consistent message from just about everybody that I've spoken to is attack white juice as juice. Interestingly, we used quite a lot of carbon this year at normally about 1 gram per litre. We found bentonite dropped most of it out, but we fermented on some carbon. The juices were grey until the end of ferment. We had observed some of our clients, because this is largely a custom crush facility, and people fermenting rosé on carbon to reduce colour because of sensitivity about excess colour in rosé. I would have always wanted to get all the carbon out, or most of it, but those people were quite comfortable, and we were under such time pressure to get things into ferment that we tolerated a small amount of carbon. The lees were disgusting and voluminous, and in some cases smelled pretty poor, and they just went straight down the drain. Normally we'd try and recover juice lees and RDB them, but obviously we didn't do. One of the Hunter winemakers used BioLees, which I think is a product from a specific distributor, probably available in the US. That was their preferred weapon of choice. The AWRI has done some survey work on different carbons, which I think is publicly available on their website. We used one which was called Acticarb PS 1300, which showed up well in their results. A word of caution to anybody using just about any carbon is that there's a need to check your iron levels afterwards, because we have seen elevated iron as a consequence of fining with heavy rates.
Okay.
So that's just a word of caution. The other approach, which I thought was interesting from one of the colleagues in the Hunter, dealing with quite strongly exposed fruit, bad fruit, was he pressed very lightly. It was machine harvested fruit due to cost. The free run coming off out of the bins was just discarded. Took about 500 litres a tonne, knowing that tonnes in this country are slightly different to tonnes in your country, just if you're getting the calculations. He fined quite heavily with BioLees, and also then racked quite quickly. He referred to the need to get it off the lees quite quickly. Then he fined with carbon. Then he put everything through an RDV, so a fairly oxidative sort of process, and then fermented clean juice. He was satisfied that working with Verdelho and Chardonnay and Albarino, that was good in the case of Semillon, which of course is the Hunter's principal white variety. The wines were sort of stripped to the point that he didn't use a lot of them. He managed to either sell them or blend them away, but he probably went too hard for that variety. So there are certainly varietal effects. The putting reds over clean skins, if you can, and this obviously doesn't work if you're in a state and you've got smoke everywhere, but if you can get some clean red fruit, ferment it, press it, and then put, and that's what people were doing with their affected fruit, shorter skin contact time, putting that wine express over the recovered clean skins which were coming out of the press from the clean fruit. A lot of people have spoken about that being an effective technique. Some people have played with RO remediation. My understanding is that that hasn't been particularly effective. The guys who have used it report an effect, but whether it's positive or negative and whether or not it's a lasting effect is an interesting question. Just a word on analytical techniques. Nobody in Australia that I've spoken to places much faith at all in measuring just the free or the volatiles. Everybody here relies on the total down, the glycosides. And I know that's a difference between our access to analytical capacity and your access to analytical capacity, which I think ETS and others are looking to address. But the strong message from everybody I've spoken to here, and we certainly saw it where we had batches which had very strong or very high concentration of glycosides, but were almost free of volatiles, and the ones were undoubtedly smoky. So yeah. I'm not here to tell you you're doing the wrong thing by any stretch, but I'd be very wary about relying only on analysis of the volatiles, or what I think you guys tend to refer to as the free.
There was a fair bit. Depending on which lab, ETS hasn't been running the hydrolyzed, but the other labs were. And one of the things that we found was that making sure that, because the technique can be so different in looking at those hydrolyzed numbers in terms of what pH they're pushed to, things like that. So we found very quickly that we needed to get better at communicating exactly what we're looking at. Like, I'm using this lab and this is what I got, sort of thing. But agreed, seems like a very useful number.
Yeah, I mean, there's really two suppliers of this analytical service in Australia, being the AWRI and Vince Essentials, and they use different techniques, and you really can't translate well between them. But I think the Institute is talking to the Vince Essentials and people in the States and elsewhere about doing an international ring test, so that we can start to draw comparisons between analytical technique results from different labs.
Thank you for that. I wanted to go, because you started to talk about RO. Marla, you have experience with mitigation from sort of this point in time, and wanted to ask you about that. And will you start with RO, what you've seen? I think that you actually haven't done RO work yourself, but have tasted through what other people have done. And so now we're talking about the wine that's in barrel or in tank at this point.
Yeah, so RO, I personally have not used RO. I've talked to a lot of people who have. I have a close colleague who's going to be using RO to treat his 2020 wines. He's tasted some wine that was affected by a fire in 2018 that had 2 RO treatments, one when the wine was young and then another treatment 6 months later. And he felt that it was a really positive effect, so he's planning to use that method to treat his 2020 wines. The treatment that we decided to go with here for Antica wines is a fairly new treatment. It's a resin that we're trying that is brand new. It's through Vinsci, which is an individual Jeff Murrell, and I think he's actually gone up into Oregon and Washington. But he's come up with this resin, and it's proprietary, so I don't know what it is. But we ended up, first we had it in a bag, which we put in the tank, and then we would mix and taste the tank, the wine coming from the tank every couple days. But it really has a positive effect at removing the negative ashtray retronasal, smoke finish on the wines. It helps with the aroma, but it has a more of an impact on the palate. And so we were just pretty blown away with the improvement in the wine that we were seeing. So he ended up coming up with a filter housing, and then there's a sort of filter bag inside the housing with the resin material inside. We tried both the granular material and the material in strips. So we ended up passing the wine through this column with this resin material, and we were very pleased with the results. In some cases, it was 1 pass was enough. In some cases, it was 2 or 3 passes, depending on the level of smoke. The unknown, because this is such a new treatment, is whether or not the smoke will come back. He's pretty confident it won't, but of course, only time will tell. And actually, this doesn't remove the phenols. We know based on analysis that we're not seeing a reduction. We've only run the free, volatile numbers. We haven't run the bound numbers, but we haven't seen a reduction in those numbers. So what we're tasting, there's clearly a difference and there's clearly an improvement, but analytically, we're not seeing a difference. So,
and then there's also the issue of whether the thing that it's removing is actually going to show up on a GCMS. Is it a volatile, or do you have to go to liquid chromatography and it might be some other compound?
Exactly.
So Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, that notion of reducing the volatiles and then I guess hoping for the best. One of the guys in the Hunter made the point that with his whites, he's rather than doing one bottling of, for the sake of the argument, 1,000 cases of wine, he's doing 3 or 4 bottlings of 200 or 300 cases of wine. So he's holding the wine in tank. He's done all of his juice treatments. He's satisfied the wine is saleable. Made that decision. Yep, this will no reserve, no high level wines, but these things are acceptable. He referred to needing a little bit of sweetness in the mid palate. He used the term when discussing with me, mid palate weight. He stressed that many times. So he has sweetened things up with a little bit of concentrate, but then he's bottling what he thinks he'll sell in a couple of months, and then
that's such a good idea.
Going back to the tank, doing a light biolese fining, filtering, bottling for sale. So he's just batch releasing. Because that way he can touch up the volatiles, which might otherwise be visible, but I think he's assuming that the taint will reoccur or reappear from the glycoside pool.
That's cool. Marla, you had also worked with, for one of the clients you've worked with, carbon and glycosidase. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that is a treatment process through Juculus or Basan. They're a group out of Italy. So they have a treatment process that's a 3-part process. So the first step is to add an enzyme called Zimerom that's supposed to be releasing the bound form of the smoke into the wine. So we add that at a rate of 3 grams per hectoliter, and we leave it on the wine for about a week. And then after that, you have to do a trial with carbon. They have a carbon that they recommend called FPS carbons. That's the carbon we've been using here. It's a vegetable type carbon. And so you do a trial to figure out the right level for the wine, because obviously every wine requires different amounts depending on the level of taint. So once you identify the amount of carbon that's going to effectively treat the smoke, then you add it, and then you wait another week for the carbon to treat the wine, and then you add bentonite, and it's a Master Vin compact is the type of bentonite. It doesn't strip the color from the red wines, and you add at a fairly low rate. So they recommend 3 grams per hectoliter. We found that wasn't enough. We add at a rate of 5 grams per hectoliter to settle the carbon. So we add the bentonite, we wait another week, and then we've been racking off of the bentonite and carbon. And then we do cross-flow filter as an additional step to remove the carbon, which I know a lot of wineries are not comfortable with, cross-flow filtration or filtration of young red wine. But, we filtered all of our wines that we were treating with the resin, because we felt that it was a way of sort of cleaning the wines. We felt the wines tasted cleaner, even if it's not removing any of the smoke.
Right.
It just gave sort of a cleaner sensation, and it's easier to treat wines that are clean. So for both our wines and our custom crush client, they're all going to be cross-flow filtered young before going to barrel.
Yeah.
So.
Anne, you had done some trials also. You've worked with carbon, but also done trials with milk.
Yes. So early on, we just decided just to try milk. So milk is not a substance that is allowed in Europe, but yet it's been fairly commonly used just to remove dry tannins, or just to fine white wines in general, just for oxidation. And I'm really just talking about whole milk, not casein. and it
Yeah.
has just a very strong absorption quality. So we decided, just why not? We've been just trying everything in our wines, and milk is an easy product just to get our hand on. So we've done milk post carbon or milk by itself, and what we found out is that milk helped a lot on the palate. So very smoke tainted wines, just that leave that really dry ashtray feel on the palate, we were able just to reduce it significantly by fining with milk. So what we've been doing now fairly commonly is we treat a wine with carbon. So anywhere we do bench trial, just between 100 ppm to as high as 800 ppm, and then
And
we
which
always
product are you using of
we use
carbon?
the phenol free from
Okay.
Inardis.
Yep.
And it has really, at least on our base wines, just no impact on color. That's why also I was just wanted just to push as much as we could extraction, so we didn't have to worry about just dropping any color with all the treatments we're just gonna use. And then just after carbon, we filter off carbon. So I haven't found a product that just settles it well enough. So just like Marla, we just go through a crossflow filter right after that, just to make sure we work on a clean base. And then we'll do just a bench trial on milk. What's been working so far is about 1% of the volume treated in milk. It's very quick to settle. We use whole milk, so it will just fall down the tank really quickly. We just pump over for 2 hours and rack after 40 hours.
Okay.
And we've been
Cool.
just no impact on the nose, but a very strong impact on just the palate and just reducing that dry ashtray feel.
Yeah. I should mention that just today, this morning, we ran one barrel as a trial of the Vinsai Jeff's trial, and then also Northwest hosted Jeff out in the parking lot, and he did trials for a bunch of people. But are going to do sort of something similar, Peter, to what you've done. We're taking this barrel. We also ran a control and racked it at the same time, so it had the same process. And then the 9 winemakers at this Carlton Winemaker Studio, the shared winery, are going to sit together and taste. And so by the time we have this, I'll put the result of that in the chat.
The one sort of scientific thing that we did with our sensory, and it was probably the most valuable part, was it's so hard to be objective about your own wine, especially if you think it's tainted. So randomising the samples and giving them to multiple tasters. It was everybody volunteered their time. It was people finding time in the midst of vintage to put aside 3 hours on a Wednesday morning and taste the whole line of pretty ordinary sort of microferment wines. But it was really important, I think, to be able to say to people, look, your sample was tasted by 5 or 6 or 7 people. And on occasions, as I said, sort of looked at somebody's score, so I've got 0.00015, and I'd just ignore that 1.5 score. That's the sort of thing I felt that I needed to do to try and give some clarity as an answer to the person who submitted the wine.
Yeah.
Somewhat at odds with what the Institute might do. They don't like people monkeying with the data. It's not scientific. But the circumstances we were in, it was better for the person that I was talking to on the end of the phone or was emailing the results to say, look, there is some ambiguity about all this, but the majority of tasters thought it was clean, or the majority of tasters thought it. I don't know the outcome of a lot of the decisions. If we said the sample was either tainted or untainted, or on rare occasions inconclusive, because that was
right.
According to the acceptance rejection criteria the Institute gave us, there were things that fell between the cracks, which is an issue we need to address because that's not helpful. So I really don't know. In rare occasions, people emailed and said, we picked that fruit and it was fine. When we said, maybe it is, maybe it's not. Other times, probably we gave the odd false positive and said this is tainted when it could have made acceptable wine. There's also, I guess, a bit of argy-bargy and concern about legal liability. Your country's far more litigious than ours. It's famously so. But there was concern about who's actually interpreting the results, who's advising people to do what. And there are issues around all that, and we're yet to resolve them. The lawyers have now got their hands, their eyes across all this sort of stuff, and it frustrates the hell out of me that people are now getting really cautious about giving an opinion when in actual fact all you're really doing is trying to do a neighbour a service by giving an opinion. They're still making the decision. But there's a few nervous people out there about doing this sort of thing in the future because, well, who holds the responsibility? Who holds the liability? That's very frustrating.
It's a good point to just go back to good old sensory science and do duo trios and things like that to make the tasting actually something that is more rigorous than just a this versus that sort of tasting.
Well, I hope so, yeah. And that's where throwing repeats in was valuable. You know, we could see, you look at the data and you can see whether or not the panel was behaving itself and getting the right answer.
Yeah. And you can publicly shame people that get it wrong. That's important.
No, I probably could, myself included, but no, the spreadsheet lives on my computer and I'm probably the only one who knows where to find it. But we actually, what we haven't talked about, we also subsampled some of those wines for subsequent analysis. So we'll actually have a set of data in the future, and the Institute must be very close to having all this data in one place. So we had where somebody had sent a sample off for grape analysis and then the wine was made as a microferment, then we sent that exact same wine that we tasted off for wine analysis. So we will be able to relate grape analysis to sensory to final wine analysis with both glycosides and volatiles. And that, when we finally get to look at that data, and that's a bit overdue now, I'm sure we'll learn something from that as well.
Yeah, that's cool. We have just a couple minutes. I wanted to talk about sales, and I think Marla, you had actually had your 2017, which I believe you didn't do any treatment on. How's the market been accepting on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I got here after the 2017 vintage, but I was here when we bottled the wine and made the decision not to do treatment. So we cross-flow filtered the wine when it was young. We put it to barrels that it would normally go to. And Renzo Cottarella, who's our CEO, tasted, and he really felt confident in the quality of the wine. And so we bottled it, and we have had no consumer complaints. And to this day, I think the wine tastes really delicious, and I don't get taint on it. You know, I don't think that's the right decision in every year or for everyone by any means. The client that we worked with did treat all of their wines, and they were pleased with the treatment that they used. But we're pleased with the decision we made. So, you know, I think everyone has to make the decision that's right for them based on their own set of circumstances. But we have had no negative consumer complaints at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Peter, you've got smoke impacted wines out in the marketplace. How have they been accepted?
Our clients.
Not you personally. I mean, people in Australia.
Yeah. Well, yes. The main experience that I'll refer to is the guy in the Hunter who had fruit, as I said, seriously exposed. There was no ambiguity about all that. His direct quote was, and I have my notes here, the fight nearly killed me, but it was worth it. Those who didn't fight the fight have wines that are shit. Forgive me. And I don't believe that those that were happy of saying just this is the wine, this is the vintage, I'll release a smoky wine, are happy with the outcomes. That's his view. Yeah. I think there's a real gap in our knowledge, and this is just simple consumer sensory work to discover in more detail. The Institute's done a little bit, and that's of some help. It's publicly available. If you haven't seen that work, you should. Do consumers react negatively to smoke-tainted wines? And if so, is it red? Is it white? What does it relate to in terms of the chemical analysis? We should be able to do that work. I think it's just a question of time, motivation, money, all those sorts of things, the usual impediments. People say we all drink Islay malt whiskies, peated whiskies, are smoky as all get up. And personally, I hate them, but lots of people love them. We all eat bacon. We all eat smoked cheese. The smoke flavors are in all sorts of things. But do consumers expect to have overtly smoky flavors in wine? I don't believe so personally, and it's not a risk I'd be willing to take. If I knew my wine was smoky, I'd be very concerned about releasing it. But taking things to the market is a very individual approach. I certainly don't have the right answer. The guy in the Hunter who did all that remedial work, who's done always doing the successive bottlings to minimise reappearance, all that sort of stuff, has had no complaints from the marketplace. He's quite comfortable with his position.
Yeah, if only it was appreciated that it was like a rarity that and our prices could go higher. Only
Good
every
luck.
once in a while, the oak tree
Good
is
luck
burned
with that
down
one.
next to the vineyard. Yeah.
I
I want to thank.
I do
Go
want
ahead,
to say
Marla.
that I don't perceive any smoke on our 2017 cab. So even though we didn't treat, the decision not to treat was made based on the fact that we weren't getting a high level of smoke or any smoke. So that decision would have been different if we were getting perceptible smoke.
Yeah, and I think that's the question: is making it right for yourself and making it right for your consumer too.
Yeah, and I don't know quite how it works in the US, but lots of us have sent samples into the institute for their panel to review things so that we can get an objective opinion. But again, it wouldn't be hard in this part of the world, and I'm guessing there, to get together a group of winemakers and to do the sort of process that we did with bucket ferments, which was hard to do in the middle of vintage. It's all time sensitive, all that sort of stuff. But collaborate, work with your colleagues to put together a panel, randomise samples, put in repeats. That's very easy to do if you're doing it in the middle of vintage, and get an objective opinion about whether or not the wine is tainted. If it's not tainted, by all means sell it.
Yeah. I want to thank all of you. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and your experiences. We are officially out of time, and thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Thank you.
me.
Pleasure.